We are officially recording. So hi everyone, again, my name is Brennison. I use she, her pronouns. I'm the Education and Outreach Coordinator at Women's Advocates, which is one of the first domestic violence shelters in the United States. Over the last 45 years, we have learned so much about domestic violence. We've expanded our physical space into 3 Victorian homes, which are all interconnected and located in St. Paul, Minnesota, where our mission is to walk with victim survivors and our community to break the cycle of domestic violence. We provide prevention and education services, provide shelter to 50 women and children every day, with various advocacy and support programs and a housing program to help survivors find and maintain safe, sustainable, affordable housing for them and their children. If you'd like to learn more about Women's Advocates, head over to our YouTube channel to watch our mini video documentary with Twin Cities PBS, which honors our 45-year legacy. Now I'll invite Mary to introduce herself and tell us a little bit more about the organization that she works at.
Thank you. I'm Mary Willis. I am a therapist, and I am specifically the early childhood therapist at Domestic Abuse Project. Domestic Abuse Project is located in Minneapolis, Minnesota, and we are really focused on providing holistic services for all members of families who are affected by domestic abuse. So we provide therapeutic services for children ages 0 to 18. We provide services for victim survivors of domestic abuse, and we provide services for people who have used abusive behaviors or been abusive towards loved ones. In addition to those, we also provide some legal advocacy services, as well as case management and care coordination services, and do some specific focused housing work through that as well. And then we also have a specific offshoot of our services for people who have used abusive behaviors, and that's called Change Step, and it's specifically for people who are military connected and have used abusive behaviors. So we do a lot of different things, and feel free to reach out to me or to go to our website. The link is below if you have more questions about that. But again, I work on our youth team, and I specifically work with young kiddos ages 0 to 6 and their parents, kids who have experienced or witnessed domestic abuse, and then the trauma and lasting effects of that.
Thank you, Mary. So now that you know a little bit more about us, we would like to know a little bit more about you all. So here is a poll question. So select the answer. You can select as many as applies to best describe your role in the community. And as with any poll, you can write your own response in the chat if any of the options don't fit. So knowing this information will help us gear a little bit of the content specifically to your work. We'll give just a few more seconds for people to submit their votes. So right now it's predominantly looking like social service providers, mental health care providers, and domestic violence advocates. Wonderful, thank you. We also have some in the chat: caregiver, public health nurse, housing manager, psychologist. We have some teachers. Thank you. So I'm gonna end the poll. Share it so you all can see who else is on the chat. So thank you for participating in that. We will keep those numbers in mind as we move forward. And I apologize if you hear any construction. There's some construction going on. So that's what those noises are if you hear them. All right, so thank you for participating in that. So we'll begin with setting the stage for a quick overview of how trauma is experienced and can impact children. So children are often missed or put on the back burner in conversations about domestic violence. So it's essential that we take the opportunity to bring them to the forefront and discuss awareness about childhood trauma across all fields so we can better support and show up for these young people. According to the National Child Traumatic Stress Network, a traumatic event is a frightening, dangerous, or violent event that poses a threat to a child's life or bodily integrity. Children who suffer from child traumatic stress are those who have been exposed to one or more traumas over the course of their lives and develop reactions that persist and affect their daily lives after the events have ended. Witnessing a traumatic event that threatens life or physical security of a loved one can also be traumatic. This is particularly important for young children as their sense of safety depends on the perceived safety of their attachment figures, which I know Mary will talk about a little bit later. Some examples of trauma experiences that children can face include things like physical, sexual, or psychological abuse and neglect, including trafficking, natural and technological disasters or terrorism, family or community violence, sudden or violent loss of a loved one, substance use disorder could be within the family, refugee and war experiences, serious accidents or life-threatening illness, or military family related stressors such as deployment, parental loss, or injury. So when children have been in situations where they feared for their lives, believed that they would be injured, witnessed violence, or tragically lost a loved one, they may show signs of child traumatic stress. So today we will be particularly focusing on child abuse as a form of trauma that we are supporting children with. So child abuse occurs when a caregiver, family member, or caretaker physically hurts a child or adolescent, makes that youth or child feel worthless, has sexual contact with them, or does not provide adequate food, care, or shelter. Some people are surprised to learn that neglect is one of the most common forms of abuse, which pertains to when a caregiver does not provide care for a child's safety and health, so necessities like food, proper clothing, a place to live, or medical care, which can absolutely be exacerbated by the challenges that have arisen with COVID-19 and the pandemic. So one form of child abuse is exposure to intimate partner violence within the household. So these are all of the different ways that a child could encounter intimate partner violence that are impactful. So it can be seeing the actual incidents of violence but not being harmed themselves, or hearing threats or noises that indicate fighting is happening, or even feeling violence through vibrations in the walls or the floor, just in the physical environment. Perhaps being a part of the violence, so maybe they're participating by coercion, force, intervening, or being assaulted themselves. Observing the aftermath, so after a particular abusive incident has happened, so things like blood, bruises, tears, torn clothing, broken items, or being aware of tension or fear in the household are all ways that children can be exposed. And all of those different ways can have an impact on children as well. So some of those impacts can include behavioral or social, so things like aggression, antisocial behavior, sleep disturbances, nightmares, flashbacks, poor relationship skills. Emotional, so developmental aggression, separation issues, emotional withdrawal, hyperarousal, anxiety, low self-esteem. Or cognitive or attitudinal, so lower assessment scores in school, maybe verbal, motor, cognitive skills may be impacted, or they might have pro-violence attitudes or belief in rigid gender stereotypes. And then they might have long-term impacts. Some studies have found that males in particular are more likely to engage in domestic violence as adults, and that females are more likely to be victims of domestic violence as adults, and also things like premature death. So we wanted to do another poll just to have a better awareness of how children you've engaged with have predominantly encountered violence in the home. And you can select as many as applies. Anything you want to add to that, Mary?
I think the only thing I would add, a question that we get a lot, both from parents and from advocates, from other folks, kind of relaying the question from parents, is like, how young are kids before they start to be affected by exposure? You know, or for example, like my child was 2 when this happened. My child was 5 when this happened. Will they be affected? Will they remember? And so the message that I usually share is that the field of trauma work is still relatively new. We only have about 20 years of like focused study on it, so we're still learning a lot. But what we do know right now is that very young children can and do take memories and like bodily experiences of trauma, of exposure, including intimate partner violence. So even very, very young children who have been exposed to domestic violence will likely take some form of that with them in some capacity.
Mhm. Yeah, thank you for adding that. So the number one way that people are sharing that they have been told that children have been encountered, that sentence made no sense. The predominant way that children have encountered violence in the home, as reported by the attendees, is being aware of tension in the home or victims' fears. And then the next two are seeing the actual incidents of violence or hearing threats or fighting noises as well.
And I am seeing that we have a question in the chat wondering why it is that children don't remember violence in the home when they get older, if this affects them on a deeper level, such as hidden trauma, or if it's possible that it doesn't affect them. And so I can speak to that a little bit, and then Brenison, you can jump in with anything else you want to add. So that's a really good question. And so part of why it's tricky to answer is because every child is so different, right? Kids are different, and every kid, every person responds to trauma very differently because every trauma is very different. So when kids are exposed to trauma before they're verbal, so like pre-verbal, before they're able to speak, they often are not able to express their memories of trauma verbally. And that's just because it isn't encoded specifically in that part of the brain, because that part of the brain isn't really active yet. So those kids, you'll see them more expressing it through play, expressing it through like more like of their feelings in the body. You know, you might see that kid get like very dysregulated. And by dysregulated, I mean like upset, or they might get aggressive. They might need a lot of sensory stimulation, so like hugs, deep pressure, swinging, rocking. Or they might be like sensory input. They might be very sensitive to it. You know, they might do what we see as overreacting, you know, touched and they jump away. Or you might see them as being very anxious, things like that. So that is typically how you'll see kids react when they've been exposed very young, rather than like outwardly talking about it like older kids might be able to. If they are exposed when they're older and they're not remembering, so sometimes what happens when you experience trauma is your body says, the best way for me to get through this and to keep surviving is to not think about it because it's so distressing. And so the body kind of just like tucks it away. And sometimes they will remember eventually, sometimes they won't. I think and this is something, you know, I'll say this again at the end of the presentation, but you're welcome to reach out and we can talk more one-on-one if you have a specific case or more specific questions. Also, please keep them coming in the chat. But again, I think case-by-case basis, you've just got to support the kid in what's most adaptive for them, what feels the best for them, what's the most supportive, and typically kids know a lot about what they need. So following their lead in that situation is pretty important for me. Brenison, would you add anything to that?
No, I think you covered everything that I thought of. We do have one more kind of related question that I would bring up here in the Q&A. Carly asks, do you see, hear, or meet with a lot of children who feel very protective of the parent who was or is being abused, and they may not remember why?
Yes, being protective of parents and other family members is a very, very, very common reaction. And yes, also common for them to not know why that's happening, even if they remember the trauma. They might not be able to connect those two things. They might not want to connect those two things. It might be too scary, you know, to think about exactly why you feel like you need to protect mom every time XYZ happens. And so for kids in that situation, what can help a lot of times is to make concrete plans, maybe to write out a safety plan, give it to them on a piece of paper, laminate it, this is what we're going to do. And to, at the same time, work with their caregiver, their parent, whoever it is that they're feeling protective of, provide a lot of education for them on why a kiddo is having a hard time with this, because oftentimes it can feel like overburdening, it can feel frustrating, it can feel repetitive for a parent, and they might not understand why their kiddo is having this impulse over and over. And it will get better with time, with repetition, with the parent repeating to them, like, you're safe, and I'll keep you safe. I'll take care of you. That doesn't have to be your job anymore. And those are also situations where I would consider recommending some form of therapy, either parent-child or just the kiddo, depending on their age, just to give them a space to play that out in a safe environment as well.
There's another related comment from Elisa saying, I've seen children become clingy to mom after they become settled into a new home. After shelter, after experiencing domestic violence, what can the mom do to help the kids?
Yeah. I say just let them be clingy. A lot of times when kids go through something scary, they'll regress developmentally. So they'll act younger. And that might be across the board, or it might be in certain situations. And again, so really wanting to validate that can be hard for parents. It can be frustrating, especially if it's something in like, say they regress in potty training, like that's super frustrating. And that's a lot of work, right? If your kiddo's having accidents every few hours potentially. So validating that for parents, saying like, this is frustrating, this is hard for you, you have so many other stressors, and this is difficult. And also letting them know that this is common and that it will get better. And then in those situations, for the kiddo, what you want to do is just support them in what they're needing, because they are doing what is best for them. A lot of times when they regress, it's because they just need to know they'll be taken care of, and they'll be safe, and they'll be loved. So if they are being super clingy, okay, cool, I'm going to give you a hug, I'm going to give you a cuddle, you need to be with me, you can be with me, that's okay. Or if we do have to be apart, I'm going to let you know how long we'll be apart for, I'm going to let you know who this safe person is you can stay with, and I will let you know exactly when I'll be back, and we'll have a way that you can tell, how long it's going to be. Just really providing all those supports and resources. And then again, that's something that will resolve on its own with continued support and repetition.
Thank you.
I'm seeing another question from Connie saying, how do we help a child being manipulated and feeling like they need to look out for the abusive parent as he is projected that he is a victim? Yeah, that's a tricky one, absolutely. And that is unfortunately a situation that we do come up against fairly frequently. And that's a tricky one because you don't necessarily want to get in the middle of it. You don't want to be in the shoes of the person who's deciding what's true and what's not true. You want to be there unequivocally as a support for kiddo and for mom and for any other folks who that's your role. So what I would say is you want to try and find the best place between supporting the child and supporting what their views are of the world, even if those maybe are coming from that person who is being manipulative or who is using abusive behaviors. You want to communicate to the child that you're here for them and that you're listening to them. But at the same time, you want to affirm and validate the viewpoint of the other caregiver. And in this situation, I would do a lot of brainstorming with the other caregiver, the one who's experiencing the abuse, and ask questions like, what would you like me to say to your child? When they say XYZ, how would you like us to handle it? And maybe brainstorm with them. How do we make it sound like, how do we affirm their feelings while at the same time providing alternate information? And so that could look like a lot like saying, I hear you, you're feeling like this. I also know, that this is true. So giving them that alternate information, but at the same time not getting into this battle of, what's right, what's wrong, because that will ultimately leave the kiddo feeling more powerless, and might push them further in the other direction.
Yeah, absolutely. I think all of these questions definitely underscore the prevalence of child abuse, and we'll definitely continue to take questions, but we'll kind of progress a little bit here into how common this experience is and a few statistics. So we're discussing this because child abuse is a lot more prevalent than many people think. So child abuse is an epidemic all over the world, and over 7.5 million children experience child abuse in just the United States, with 74.9% of child abuse victims being neglected, which has a tendency to not get as much attention as some of the other forms of abuse. In Minnesota specifically, you'll see that a high percentage of children who experienced abuse were 8 years old and younger. And so that will be important to keep in mind for later when we talk about developmental warning signs and support. And you'll also see that children who hold specific marginalized ethnic identities experience child abuse at disproportionate rates. And then the links are on the screen too if you want to look into that report more closely. And then similarly, there are many other aspects of the world in addition to culture that children exist in, whether they understand it or not. So there are all these different systems that include their lives and how they experience and respond to child abuse. Children who hold various different identities, whether that's their gender, spirituality, disability, citizenship, religion, geographic location, ethnicity, family structure, socioeconomic status, or age. So understanding that not every child is the same is very crucial, and that specific identities will shape our advocacy as well.
Okay, so going back to what Brennan had mentioned about a slide ago, that we do see that folks who are members of marginalized identity groups experience abuse and experience domestic violence at much higher rates. And I feel like along with that, it's important to talk about discrepancies in the child protection system. So there are a lot of links on this page, and feel free to click through them later on. We'll send out a link to the PowerPoint. They are really powerful reading. But things I want to highlight are that there are huge discrepancies across CPS systems for children of color. So Black children are more likely to be removed from their homes and have termination of parental rights as a result of CPS claims. Black pregnant women are reported for drug use at nearly 10 times the rate of white pregnant women, despite similar rates of substance use. That is a really fascinating and extremely eye-opening study. Children of color are 3 times more likely to be reported to CPS for possible abuse-related injuries. Yes, CPS is Child Protective Services. Thank you for clarifying. And feel free to tell me if I'm getting too acronym heavy or something. Sometimes I just put my nerd hat on a little bit too much and jump right into it. Well, children of color are more likely to be reported for possible abuse than white children, even though they had similar results on a skeletal exam. And finally, caseworkers' perception of risk when considering if kids need to be removed from a household due to threat of injury was significantly influenced by the race of the kids. So the reason for chatting about this is because we know that unfortunately CPS is often very much involved in domestic violence cases and in cases of child abuse. And we want to be mindful that there are significant dynamics of race and of racism at play there. And that's something that we need to keep in our minds while we're in this discussion. And let's see, okay, here we go. So the next thing that I think is important to talk about is adverse childhood experiences. And I am guessing a lot of folks here have heard of the adverse childhood experiences. Also, I will use the acronym ACE or ACEs, and that just stands for adverse childhood experiences. So this study is one of the largest studies ever conducted on associations from childhood trauma and later health and well-being. And so basically what they did was they created this researchers created a list of adverse experiences in childhood, forms of trauma, including domestic violence, other health problems, like death or loss of a significant caregiver. And they recorded kids who had had these things and kids who hadn't. And then they checked back in with them later, and what they found is that kids who had experienced these adverse effects, these are adverse experiences, have higher risks of health complications in later life. So physical health, mental health, social problems, and early death. So that is a pretty profound, pretty impactful, and honestly pretty sad thing to hear, right? It's a big study, and it's been very important. So a couple things to know is that it doesn't have any sort of control for cultural differences, for historical trauma. It doesn't account for that at all in individual experiences. Additionally, it doesn't account for resilience. And we'll talk more about resilience later on, but it doesn't account for client supports. It doesn't account for all the positive things they have going in their lives as well. And I would caution all of you who work with clients in a professional capability is if and when you do bring up this study, just to be cautious with it, because folks who have experienced domestic violence often experience a lot of shame and guilt around it, and so they can often hear the study and feel that it is somehow their fault or that they've exposed their child to these things, when in reality they made no choice to be affected by domestic violence. That was the choice of the person using abusive behaviors. So let's talk about the other side of the picture then. Here we go. So there's also a really great study out there, and that is the Positive Childhood Experiences study. And this one came on a little later on in life. So after the ACEs study, it was, I don't have the year here, but it was more recent than the ACEs study. So positive childhood experiences are exactly what it sounds like. Good things that happened in childhood. So being able to, having a significant adult support who was there for a big part of their childhood, having a stable home, having access to food, having access to academic supports, all those things you'd think of as supportive for kids. And then they also looked at adult-related social and emotional supports. So what those are, you'll see those listed in the figure to your right. And that is being able to talk about feelings, feeling like your family stood by you, feeling safe and protected by adults, etc. So they looked at kiddos and they asked how many of these things in both categories they had experienced. And the findings were that as adults, the people with lowest levels of adult mental illness had the highest levels of positive childhood experiences or high levels of the adult-related social and emotional supports, which is ARSES, which is kind of a fun acronym. And then lower levels of the positive childhood experiences predicted higher levels of adult mental illness. And so I really love this study because it's a way to look at that ACEs study, which again can hit pretty heavy, can be a little bit hard to hear and say, okay, but look, we also have studies that say when you have an important person in someone's life, when you have people who are willing to listen, then we can also show that they have better outcomes, that they're more resilient, and that they will have a better trajectory in life as well. So that's like a bit of the other side of the coin there. All right, let's talk a little bit about what typical development might look like for kids then, because development is a big part of trauma, especially for early childhood kiddos. So for everyone who would like to participate, and I certainly hope it's a bunch of people because participation activities are always more fun when we have more people. But the question that we'd like you to answer is, what does typical child development look like? And again, make sure that your chat function is set to either all panelists or all panelists and attendees if you'd like other folks to be able to see what you're writing. So there's really no right or wrong answer in this one. It can be across the typical fields of development. But what does typical development look like for you? I'm seeing socializing, yes, absolutely, socializing both with other kids and with adults. Emotional, yeah. Healthy attachment, perfect. We're going to talk about attachment a little more. Oh, awesome. Independence, yes. Community care, yes. Building those community relationships. Speech and motor skills, absolutely. Emotional regulation skills, that's huge. Curiosity, I'm seeing a couple of those. That is awesome, yes. Having a safe environment, hitting major milestones, fine and gross motor skills, yeah. Tantrums, yeah, tantrums are developmentally normal. Communication, independence, connectivity, connecting with others, empowerment, exploring their environment. You guys are like hitting the nail on the head. That is awesome. So one thing, I want to go through 2 quick case studies here, just contrasting how typical development might look and how not atypical development might look. So our first one is Jane, and Jane's going to be our example of typical development. So Jane is walking at around 1 year. She is talking at around 1 year. Her first word is go. She goes to preschool. She has little friends at preschool. She's able to interact with them. She does a little bit of cooperative play with them. She can share toys. After about 2 weeks of crying at drop-off, she's able to separate from her parents pretty independently. She plays appropriately. She does some imaginative plays. So she might, make a little family with some dolls and have them cook breakfast. She's doing some good cognitive play. She's separating shapes. She's putting them into a shape sorter. She's putting together a simple puzzle. Then Billy is our example of a kiddo who might not have as typical of development. So Billy is not talking as much. He doesn't say his first word until he's about 20 months old, which is, again, not super atypical, especially for boys, but he's only using single words till he's about 2.5 years old. He has a vocabulary of maybe 10 words, so a little bit behind. He consistently cries and screams for 1 to 2 hours after he's dropped off at daycare, even after several months. So really not able to regulate after his parents are gone. He doesn't really know how to play with the other kids. He prefers to play by himself, doesn't really seem to notice the other kids, but sometimes he'll get up and he'll hit one of them out of the blue, or he'll snatch their toy and run away, and he has trouble connecting that. When they get mad at him, then he seems not to understand why that is. He's typically pretty agitated, moves quickly, has trouble sticking with one activity over the other. So those are our 2 contrasting examples, and obviously those are pretty polarized. You typically don't see kids presenting in that sort of all or nothing fashion. But the reason I wanted to present those 2 little vignettes is because development is very often affected by childhood trauma exposure and by attachment, which is what we're going to talk about next. And attachment, especially in kids who have experienced trauma and kids who have witnessed domestic violence, can easily be disrupted. And then when attachment is disrupted, that often causes difficulties in typical development in gaining those typical skills at the times that we'd be looking for those. Here we go. Okay, thanks for bearing with me. The technology doesn't always love me. All right, so attachment theory. Let's talk about how well we all know attachment theory. So if you could pull up that poll, perfect, thank you. So which best describes your knowledge of attachment theory? There's no right or wrong answer. We're just curious about where you're coming from. So we will give you a little bit of time to answer that question. All right. Yep. Perfect. Okay, awesome. So we have a pretty equal distribution. Some folks have a little knowledge, some have, I'd say most people are kind of in that middle area, having a decent amount, are pretty comfortable, and then we have some who are pretty experienced as well. That's awesome. So let's chat through this pretty quickly. And then we have another question and answer right in the chat for afterwards. So attachment theory, first come up with through Bowlby, who is one of our good old, earlier times psychological researchers. So Bowlby came up with the idea that parents and caregivers are attachment figures, and children have this innate need to have a caregiver who is there for them, to form attachment with this caregiver, who's usually, in his point of view, this was usually a mother, but usually a consistent parent or caregiver. So then this person forms a secure base, and the child can kind of venture out from them, explore the world, and then come back. And that's how they learn things they need for survival. And then as they get older, they develop multiple attachment figures. That's more around age 2. And then Mary Ainsworth came along. She was a student of Bowlby's, and she was like, yes, let's expand on this some more. So Ainsworth and one of her students as well started to come up with these specific categories of attachment in consultation with Bowlby. And so that is secure attachment, anxious attachment, and avoidant attachment. And then later, Ainsworth's student, and I'm not remembering her last name, but her first name is Mary. I know that much. She came up with the idea of disorganized attachment as well. And one thing that Mary Ainsworth did, along with her student, was they did this thing called the strange situation. So a toddler and their mother would come into a room. I'm guessing a bunch of you have heard this, but hear me out again quick. And then mom would leave. They look to see how kiddo responds. Then a stranger comes in. They look to see how kiddo interacts with the stranger. Then they leave and mom comes back. And they used the results from that to really assess the attachment style. So first things first is we'll talk through these attachment styles. So the secure attachment is a kiddo who's had a consistent parent who's been available for them most of the time. So this kiddo would get in the strange situation. They get upset when parent leaves. They would probably be pretty fearful of the stranger because they don't know them. They're not going to be able to take comfort from them. And then when the parent comes back, they're pretty quickly able to be soothed and continue exploring the room. Anxious attachment is a kiddo who has had less availability, theoretically, from their parents. So that's a child who's fussy or who's not easily soothed. They will likely cry when the parent leaves the room. They will not really engage with that stranger. But then when the parent comes back, they will not be as easily soothed. They might be wanting to be close, be held, but that won't comfort them. They'll continue to cry, or they might be irritable as well. And then there's the avoidant type. So that is a child, again, who likely hasn't had as available of a caregiver, and they are less interactive with their caregiver. They might avoid or ignore them. They might not show as much of a reaction when they leave. When the stranger comes into the room, they might interact with them just as much as they did the caregiver. And then when caregiver comes back, they will, again, likely not acknowledge it as much. And these kiddos, if they get hurt or they fall, they might not go to their caregiver for comfort. So again, not really seeing them as much as a secure base. And then that fourth category of attachment, disorganized, that one's a little bit more, I guess one metaphor I've heard for it is more of like a bucket that you dip out of rather than a fourth category in and of itself. So disorganized attachment is behaviors that you see that that doesn't really fit what we know of any of the 3 other styles. Or maybe behaviors that are contradictory. Sometimes that can happen in the context of a specific trauma trigger. You might have a kiddo who appears pretty secure, but then in a specific situation, they don't know what to do with themselves and they shut down or they avoid their caregiver entirely. That might be a moment of disorganization. Disorganization is typically associated with trauma. And so the other thing I want to impress is that attachment theory, they aren't exclusionary. you don't have to fit the child into like one box and one box alone of one style of attachment. It's more of a spectrum. So you might have a kiddo who appears more anxious, but also has elements of having secure attachment. Or you might have a kiddo who sometimes appears avoidant and sometimes appears anxious. I think it's important to realize that kids are always going to be more than their attachment style, and that any sort of attachment style, there's no right or wrong answer, because at the end of the day, attachment style is a way to describe how the kiddo has best learned to navigate the world around them, right? Like they've learned that however they are behaving is the best way for them to survive in the situations that they're in. So if they have a caregiver who's not super available, then yeah, they are going to learn to navigate the world on their own because that's what they need to do. So again, really want to have that viewpoint of that this is how the child has learned what's best for them. And maybe we do want them to help them see that they can rely on adults as well, but wanting to continue to respect their independence and their own learning up to this point as well. So here's another chat question for you all to jump in. How do you see attachment styles in the kiddos you work with?
We also have a few questions while people are thinking about their responses. There was one comment already that kind of touches on what you just prompted from Maricela. I see a pattern where the parent that has also suffered trauma has attachment issues with the child that has suffered trauma as well.
Yeah. Yep. And that's something we talk a lot about, generational trauma that's passed down inadvertently from parent to child, often over many, many generations. Mm-hmm. And that sounds like what you're describing, Maricela. But yeah, great comment. Thank you for bringing up that point.
And then there's a question, can the child show disorganized attachment by constantly telling the parent they don't care for them and they don't care if something happens to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great question. I think that would be a really, so I'm going to say yes, but kind of like with an asterisk behind it, right? Because I think in a perfect world, we'd want a little bit more context on that. What that really sounds like to me, and again, this is just kind of off the top of my head, but when you have a kiddo saying, I don't care for you, or to a parent, I don't care if something happens to you, what I hear that child saying is like, I'm scared for what it would be like if I did care about you and something happened. Or maybe like something scary has happened in the past when I did care about someone and then they left or they got hurt, and that hurt me. I really hear that as defensiveness. So it absolutely could fall into disorganized attachment, but I wonder if there's something more there as well. And then I see a comment from Jessie as well of saying there are biological predispositions as well. Some kids are nervous naturally. Yeah, absolutely. That's kind of where you get into that nature versus nurture, right? There are kids who are going to be born and who will just be a little bit more anxious, or who are going to be a little bit more chill. Or there are kids who are just going to be running all day long, and that's absolutely a big part of the equation as well. So thank you for bringing that up. That's a super important point, Jessie.
There's one more question about disorganized. So Riley says, so you said disorganized is typically a sign of trauma. Is that because when they become rejected or anxious, it could be because of a trigger?
Yeah, absolutely. I think especially where trauma has occurred within a relationship. So like there's been a relationship with someone they trusted, maybe they got in an argument, maybe that person had to go away. Then yeah, you do see a lot of becoming defensive, maybe having that shutdown reaction, maybe pushing other people away. And so that's in the context of a trauma, right? So I would categorize that more as disorganized. Yeah, and I'm seeing folks saying anxious, avoidant, a little bit of everything, secure, anxious, avoidant, anxious and avoidant. Yeah, okay, I'm seeing a child who's secure but screams and has difficulty sleeping during the night, a little bit of everything. Yeah, so it sounds like we have kind of a variety of those things, and I'm impressed that you all seem like you have a good viewpoint and a good conceptualization, what those kiddos' experiences are like. I'm seeing a question from Valerie, and I think we'll take these. See 2 questions, so I think we'll take these 2 questions here and then move on for now, although feel free to keep sending the questions and we will try our best to get to them. So Valerie asked, what about kiddos who attach very easily to almost any adult? Is that a sign of trauma? So again, this is something where I wouldn't want to absolutely give a one way or the other answer because it's something you need more context on. But yeah, there are kids who maybe haven't had that secure attachment figure, who haven't had that one person who's kind of that secure base where they can go out into the world, explore, then come back, who provide safety, security, love, nurturance, all those things we want from our attachment figure, parent caregiver. And so those kiddos can be more likely to attach quickly to any adult in their lives. And that's typically because, so again, we're thinking of attachment as how do I best get my needs met in the situations I've been in. So that kiddo has learned, well, maybe there won't be any adult who is here for me consistently. So I'm just going to go to every adult I see and try to get what I need from them. And then, maybe that relationship won't last too long on the kiddo's end just because they've learned over time, like, I can't expect adults to stick around, so I'm not going to do that. So I would absolutely say that could be a sign of trauma or just a sign of not having a secure attachment figure. But yeah, trying again to put it in that context of what is the most adaptive functioning for the kiddo. And then our last question from Maricela is, if child was abounded by mom, she is more likely to be afraid to get close to dad because she fears he might do the same. So I'm thinking that if child was abused by mom, that could be, yeah, the kiddo could be afraid to get close to dad if she's experienced abuse from other attachment figures, especially if they were close. Kids definitely pick up on patterns. Because again, patterns are kind of how you learn to survive as a young individual in this world. You learn, if X happens and then Y happens, and you're going to try and predict that so that you'll be ready next time it happens, right? So if kiddo has learned, I got close to this person and then they hurt me, then yeah, they're going to be afraid to get close to the next person who comes along because they're going to be afraid that person will hurt them too. And so what that caregiver can do is just a lot of reiteration of, I'm safe, I'm here, I'm going to support you, vocalizing those things and then showing them those things, just through like physical actions as well, and giving kiddo the opportunity to talk about those things or play about those things.
Mm-hmm. Thank you all so much for your wonderful questions. We want to make sure we get through all the material, so I'll quickly go through the next few slides, but still feel free to send in your questions. Using the Q&A feature might be a little bit helpful, so the chat doesn't get too cluttered. But a little bit more, we've alluded to the developmental differences earlier. So trauma can look like and can impact children in different ways depending on their age and depending on their developmental stages. And so studies have shown that there are these different developmental impacts. They're all kind of listed on the screen here, so I won't read all of them out to you, but this graphic kind of breaks down some of the developmental differences depending on the age. And so this isn't to say that if you observe any of these things, you should automatically assume that they're experiencing abuse, but it's just a guide for you to be aware of certain responses as they relate to the specific population that you might work with. And so we attached a few links on the screen and some further in the later slides if you want to explore more about developmental lens. And if you have any particular questions about that, you can send them in the chat as well. And then advancing on to some immediate reactions that you might see and observe in children who have experienced abuse. So again, if they experience it directly, indirectly, have knowledge of it, see it, they intervene, kind of seek help, all those different ways. There's different short-term or immediate reactions that they may have. And one that I do want to point out that sometimes gets overlooked is perfectionism or overachievement. So if a child reacts in this way, it might be difficult for teachers to pick up. They might label them as saying, oh, they're a good student. That might blind teachers or others to acknowledging that something might be going on at home. So knowing that that is a response as well, in addition to other things that we've mentioned before, like repetitive talk or play, trouble sleeping, passiveness, maybe on the flip side, poor academic performance when they're typically a good student, or not, I wouldn't say good, but may not have the same kind of struggles with when it comes to academics, maybe hyperarousal, self-blame, avoidance, anxiety, maybe physical complaints. A lot of times they describe as their stomach really hurts or their head really hurts. So it might manifest in more physical reactions as well. And so one prompt that we'll invite you all to reflect on and add to the chat if you'd like is what are ways that you can support children through these immediate reactions to abuse? So if you take a moment just to think about some things that come to mind. If you're working with a child who's displaying any of these reactions, how can you immediately support them in that moment? Jesse says validating the child's feelings. Absolutely. Yeah, sometimes depending on what your role is, you don't want to see children be upset, and you might have a tendency to want them to, stop crying, or you want to help them right away. But sometimes help can look like allowing them to truly feel how they're feeling in that moment, and know that it's okay, and that they're allowed to experience that as well. Katie says create a safe holding environment for children to express themselves. And oh, we're getting lots of messages. Sorry, let me go back. Express themselves and reflect on their feelings, offer a safe space, explaining what happened instead of what's wrong with you. Yeah, that's more trauma-informed language. Reassurance, allowing them to have their feelings, provide structured environment and support, mindfulness for child-grounded work, teaching deep breathing, mindfulness, give them the freedom to talk when they're ready. So yeah, giving them that agency. Listening to their words, what they say and don't say, along with gaining their trust. Children exposed to intimate partner violence can often display a certain level of mistrust. Absolutely, those are all really great ideas. So thank you for participating in that. We will continue on to some things that were already kind of mentioned. So children automatically experience trauma and abuse in their mind and bodies. In their mind, they may think things like, I'm stupid, it's my fault, no one will ever love me, I hate myself. These are really difficult things for adults to hear children say, but many times the person perpetrating abuse is telling them these things, or their actions make them feel that way. So researchers sometimes call this thinking errors. The problem with thinking errors for victims is that one thought can turn into a belief and then defines that person's overall identity, or creates a belief that is ingrained and eventually looked upon as the truth. So it can be important to pay attention to the thinking errors of these children, and encourage parents to challenge them by engaging in conversation. So again, keep the goal in mind as to where you want the conversation to go, then keep asking questions that will kind of move in that direction. Another aspect of the mind involves emotions. So emotions can present a little differently in children than they do in adults, but many of these emotions are connected to somatic or physical bodily sensations or problems. So again, things that we mentioned earlier of children maybe saying that their tummy feels like a big flaming ball of fire, and maybe bedwetting or nightmares, and then there's some responses on the screen of like kind of how to counter or address those. So there's another prompt of how we can shift through those thoughts, emotions, and somatic problems, but I think you all kind of answered those in the last engagement that we did, so we'll kind of move over that. But if you think of anything that you want to share with the rest of the group, feel free to add it in the chat.
Okay, folks, and I think in the interest of time, we are going to skip over this particular activity. But what I would like you to think about, and you can definitely throw it in the chat here, is what, for you, what does providing support look like? Or alternately, what does it feel like? What does it sound like? But in your role, whether professionally or personally, how does it feel to support survivors and to support kiddos? Right. And then Renison, if you want to take over.
Yeah. So bolstering on our conversation about support that you all have probably been thinking about a lot, it's important to know Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So making sure that those basic and psychological needs are met first is important in being able to truly nurture children. Once these needs are met, we can start to focus on the tenets of nurturing children in ways that advocates, providers, case managers, and the like can support children and parents, and things such as providing physical safety. So can you help the children and parent safety plan, like Mary mentioned earlier? Do they have a place to go if their current living situation becomes increasingly unsafe? Does the child know how to identify when they feel physically safe and physically unsafe? How can we promote emotional security? So do children know how to express how they're feeling? Do they feel safe to tell a trusted adult when they're scared, sad, upset, or worried? And then building trust and respect. So does the child have an adult that they feel comfortable confiding in? Are those adults treating the child with respect? And then as a caregiver, caring for yourself. So when nurturing children, it's important to make sure that you're also tending to your own personal needs. So the saying, "you can't pour from an empty cup," absolutely applies to our ability to show up and support children. As well as giving affection, our children receiving affection in a way that's not manipulative, coercive, or unsafe. Are there multiple people in the child's life to encourage and support them in their interests, education, and sense of self? Are you allowing ample time for them to heal and grow? And is there a clear delineation between discipline and harm? So those are some tenets to kind of keep in mind as we continue to think about how we can truly support children, and how we can nurture them after they have experienced or been exposed to abuse.
Okay, and just looking at some of our responses in the chat, they are wonderful. So how we provide support involves teaching coping skills, giving kiddos the freedom to talk, giving them respect, validation, active listening has been mentioned multiple times. Yeah, staying present with them, listening and believing them, listening to the words they say and they don't say. Awesome. Yeah, really great responses there. So let's think about what networks of support might look like for kiddos. So this is just an example here. So we have the child in the center and then some of their important support people around them. So it might be their teacher, their school counselor, their parents, their extended family, their advocate, shelter staff if they're at a shelter, a family therapist, individual therapist. And that's just an example, but thinking about all those people who are present and important in the child's life and how they are there for the child in all sorts of different ways. Then I have two other examples of what those networks of support can look like. So this is actually a support network graphic from California, and for support mapping during COVID, but it actually works really well for kiddos and survivors of domestic violence as well. So this is a little bit more of an ecological framework, thinking about your closest family and friends, then good friends and family in the second level, then casual friends and relatives, and then acquaintances and neighbors. So that's another way to think about it. And then another thing we'd have to think about is where do we put service providers in that? And then the other one that we have, so this is called pod mapping, and it's from the Bay Area Foundation. They do a lot of really, really great work for survivors of abuse and domestic violence. But this is thinking about specifically folks who are in your quote unquote pod. So people who are close to you and who are supportive, and then people who might be linked to that through other networks as well. So these are all things you can pull from the PowerPoint afterwards when we'll send it out, and use these with kiddos and with families to talk about who is there for them as a support network, both personally in their lives and then professionally as well. The other thing to think about when we're talking about supporting families, oh, come on, go back. No, go back. Sorry. I might need help, Renison. Technological, oh, here, oh, thank you, you're saving me here. Okay, perfect. Scope of practice and limitations. So that's the other thing. I think when you're talking about how do you support clients, how do you support kiddos, right? You always have to think about, when do you stop? In other words, when do you hit your limitations or your scope of practice? So, and how do you know? So scope of practice is different for every person and for every role. And that's a conversation you need to have with yourself, with your supervisor, with each client. Talk about, at what point do we need to get help from somebody else as well? And what is my job really going to be to support you? It's important to know who supports your client. That's why it's important to use those previous slides to talk about who else is there to support them. So if you do hit, like, okay, this is my limit, let's go look at your network of support, and oh, look, here's, Auntie Jean and your individual therapist. You can reach out to both of them and I'll help you, and then they can help you, fill out this housing application. And that's just an example. Also thinking about what burnout looks like for you, right? If we're working in the nonprofit field, burnout is super, super real. And I'm guessing most of us have encountered it, but thinking about, what does it look like for you? Because burnout's different for everybody, and then recognizing the signs of that and taking action towards it. So that might look like not feeling like you want to get out of bed in the morning. That might look like having a really hard time getting paperwork done. That might look like having an extra glass of wine at night, because it's the only way you can get work off your mind. Just like thinking of those little signals that are starting to signal to you that you're getting overwhelmed. And then finally, again, just really helping your client to learn to work with multiple providers and to do some of that resourcing work for themselves, so they're set up to be independent in the future. And I think we'll probably skip that poll again for the sake of time. Okay.
So, sorry. All right. So, in regard to that scope of practice, there are still ways of providing trauma-informed advocacy and care within one scope of practice. So the 5 tenets of trauma-informed advocacy include choice, empowerment, collaboration, trustworthiness, and safety. My brain wanted to say empowerment. It's paramount. Maybe that's where my brain was going. So applying this to working with children is important. Sometimes choice can be as simple as allowing the child to decide if they want water or a different drink before working with them, or asking if they like to use the restroom before the session or after. Allowing children to make these choices instead of deciding for them can help them feel more of a sense of agency in their interactions with you. And similarly, empowering children can look like affirmations, such as reminding them that they are valuable. And other ways to empower children can include things like encouraging the process rather than focusing on a perfect outcome, or allowing for do-overs, and pausing before intervening. And so also verbally acknowledging any pride or joy or relief or sense of accomplishment that the child may feel after maybe doing something that they have been working toward, they achieved a goal. And then, so I'll include in the chat, this is some more, a link to more information about empowering children. And then collaboration can look like focusing on working together with the child, brainstorming solutions, listening and expressing empathy before giving an opinion or a solution. And then building that trust with a child can include acknowledging the emotions that you see in the child by using neutral language to describe what you observe. So things like, I see that you're very frustrated with your sister, or the best way to teach that emotional responsibility is to, lead by example, right? So maybe advising parents to maybe try when they're in a conflict with another person to allow the kids to see the behind the scenes of how, as the parent, you take emotional responsibility for the situation. So I'll include a link about building trust with children in the chat. And then lastly, that's safety. So the link on the screen has safety planning. It has safety planning for teens, but also safety planning for children. It has kind of like a coloring book method too, and different ways of identifying what does safety mean. So maybe that can include, knowing safe locations, who they can contact, who are their safe people. And so there's more on that on the link as well if you'd like to check that out.
All right, so talk a little bit about some therapeutic approaches for supporting kiddos who have witnessed domestic violence, since that's a bit of my wheelhouse. And again, we're going to go through these pretty quickly. We do want to be time sensitive, and there are some slides coming up that I want to be able to spend a little more time on. But child-parent psychotherapy, which is a dyadic child and parent or child and caregiver intervention. That's for really young children, ages 0 to 6. Attachment and biobehavioral catch-up, very similar, also dyadic, focused on the relationship between parent and child. That is for, I believe, ages 0 to 5, so also very, very young. Trauma-focused cognitive behavioral therapy, often called TFCBT, that is something that can be used with a wider range of ages, from around age 4 to age 18 and older. And that really focuses around creating a narrative about the trauma that's occurred, and then teaching proactive coping skills so that they can deal with the emotions and somatic symptoms brought up by discussing the trauma as they create that narrative. Non-directive play therapy is a tool that can be used with children of all ages, pretty much. Not like infants, maybe. That's a little too young. But that is really letting kids play and letting them play out the trauma that has occurred, and providing support, validation, and narration. Circle of Security is a group modality. So it is a group that meets. It's often weekly, facilitated by somebody who's been trained in this specific modality, and is really focused on building that attachment between parent and child, and educating the parent on effects of trauma. And then finally, parent-child interactive therapy, PCIT, is another parent and child therapy, and that's focused around setting the limits and boundaries, but doing so in a healthy way. And there's also kind of like an offshoot modality of that, specifically for kiddos who are anxious. And if you have more questions on these, please feel free to reach out to me to chat about them. We also wanted to touch on culturally informed approaches. And so providing the caveat that every single therapeutic modality, like all the ones we just talked about, need to be approached with like a framework or a lens of cultural consideration, right? We always want to be talking about what the kiddo and the family and the larger environment, what the cultural context is, what forms of power and control and societal oppressions are present, and how that influences the context. That being said, there are some very specific adaptations of trauma-focused therapies. So adapted TFCBT, that model is used primarily for African American families. Also the SMART, Safety, Monitoring, Advocacy, Respect, and Treatment, that is used with children who have experienced sexual abuse. And that one as well has an adapted model for African American families. The Sanctuary Model, or TSTR, Trauma Systems Therapy for Refugees, has been used with Ecuadorian families and Spanish-speaking families. So that modality is developed specifically for those groups. And it has also been used with Somali and Bhutanese folks. And then adapted CPP, child parent psychotherapy, has been used specifically with Latinx and Spanish-speaking populations. And there have been multiple successful iterations of that. All right, so let's talk about how to talk about trauma with kids. So this is for folks who are working with kids, for service providers. So first, keep it developmentally appropriate. You know, you don't want to be talking with a 2-year-old about like, well, you've experienced complex trauma, and that's going to be developmentally pervasive in many levels, right? And then you don't want to be with a 15-year-old and being like, yeah, that was scary, that felt yucky for you. They're both gonna like just shut down. You want to recognize any and all of their feelings as valid, even if it doesn't fit what we might think it should be. Like, that's what they're feeling and they're sharing it with you. So you want to say like, yeah, I hear you, you're feeling XYZ. You don't want to use shaming or blaming language when discussing behavior. You know, and we know that kids who've experienced trauma they might have more aggressive behaviors. They might not be able to handle being in, you know, a classroom for 8 hours a day. You might see them more aggressive. They might hit a trauma trigger and, you know, rip a bunch of stuff up. And so what we want to do is say something more like, you know, like, I wonder what was going on today when you hit little Timmy, you know, rather than, oh, you hit little Timmy. Why were you being so bad? You want to stay away from those like stigmatizing and blaming languages. And a lot of times too, kids go through this developmental thing, and around age 4 or 5, they begin to realize that they are not, in fact, the center of the universe. But before then, they are really convinced that everything that happens is directly their fault. So that makes it tricky, because then younger kids do really wonder, like, is it my fault? Did I make this happen? You know, did I make this abuse happen? And so they oftentimes will see themselves as bad or think they could have done something differently. So we don't want to connect any sort of like additional behavior to that. We don't want to reinforce it. Even when we really want to know stuff from them, we don't want to like push them or force them in sharing information or like talking about things that have happened to them. If they're not ready, that can be pretty traumatic for them. Especially with older kids, you want to let them know if you're a mandated reporter, you know, if you're going to have to share stuff, because that can also be pretty traumatic. You know, so you might just want to let them know, like, hey, we can talk about whatever you want, but I want you to know that if you tell me something that makes about someone hurting you or about you being in danger, I might have to tell somebody else. You want to be honest. Kids who have witnessed domestic abuse, they've been through a lot of patterns of power, control, manipulation. So you want to give them as much control over their life as possible. And along with that comes honesty. So again, using developmentally appropriate language, but staying honest. One of the biggest things that comes up, like, it's okay to say you don't know. It's okay to say, like, I'm gonna have to get back to you on that. Like, kids will be okay with that. We don't always have to have the answers. And then finally, letting them decide how much they want to be a part of the recovery work. So we talked about this earlier, but kids can often like want to parent. They like parentify, right? They want to parent their parents. They want to be the protector, the caregiver. So being honest with them and saying like, hey, we're doing this and this and this for you guys, you know, like, or mom's going to go see an apartment next week. Do you want to go with her? Things like that. You want to give them choices and let them participate as much as they want to or don't want to, but also just giving them opportunities to be a kid. And sometimes that might be too hard, but continuing to give those opportunities, and eventually they'll take you up on it. And then as a service provider, how do you talk with parents? So I think one thing that we often jump to is being very positive. And we do, right? We want to be positive and instill hope. but we want to be cautious that we're not overdoing that, because sometimes, especially folks who have recently experienced trauma, sometimes that can feel a little bit too kind of on one end of the spectrum. So saying things like, how would it feel to you? You know, let me know if this doesn't feel accurate. Like, let's try this and see, you know, how would it feel to think about, you know, maybe things might feel better tomorrow. Trying to redirect the focus. So like we just talked about, kids who might have a behavioral outburst, have some trouble, trying to talk about what's really going on there for the kiddo rather than talking about how to control it. You know, so instead of talking about like, how do we keep little Billy from wrecking the classroom again, talking about like, I wonder what was going on for Billy. You know, it sounds like his classmate said, I'm going to beat you up right before that. What do you think that could have been about? Also keeping in mind that parents often feel really, really, really guilty about what their kids have witnessed, even though, again, want to reaffirm that it's not parents' fault, right? When you experience domestic violence, that's not something that you choose, but that's often not communicated to folks, and they don't often feel like that's correct. So, you know, again, talking about like the ACEs study, you want to be mindful when you're providing that information and want to make it feel manageable. Normalizing and validating. Your child is not the only one. You're not the only one who's been through this. Children often react like this. It's often hard for kids. You know, the reality is that a lot of kids do, quote unquote, act out after being through difficult things because they just don't know how to handle it, and it will get better. Find opportunities for them to have community. It can be so, so helpful to have a group of other folks, or even just somebody else who's been through the same things, who's felt the same way. Like I'd mentioned before, no, it's okay not to know. It's okay to tell kids you don't know. It's okay to tell parents you don't know. It's okay to, I would advocate for being transparent, you know, saying, I don't know, and I'm going to talk with this person and I'm going to get back to you. And then be aware, again, of vicarious trauma and burnout for yourself, and be aware of the warning signs of that. And we're going to skip this chat question because we are really running out of time here.
So just a little bit more on how you may be asked by parents of how the parents can talk to their own kids about trauma, or specifically about abuse. And so you may find that a parent who's experiencing abuse and a parent who is using abuse may be co-parenting together. So this table just kind of provides a few bulleted lists of things that each respective parent can say if they are seeking support. So again, you will receive this slide in your email, so I'll allow you to explore that as it applies later on. And then a little bit more about fostering resiliency. So we'll just kind of use this as the last poll for you all to think about which of the following ways you can see yourself contributing to fostering a child's sense of resiliency. And so you can select as many as applies, any that kind of stand out to you. We'll just take a few moments for this. So almost all of these options have been highly selected by everyone, so that's wonderful. There's multiple ways that we are all working to foster resiliency for the children that we work with. I'll go ahead and end and see internal strength recognition and fostering a sense of connection and belonging were the top two. So absolutely, thank you for your work and contributing to that poll. And then if you want to learn more about those skills and everything, we attached a link at the bottom. And then
I don't think we'll have time for the case example, unfortunately.
But you can kind of read that on your own and brainstorm how to build a network of support and
Mm.
resiliency using those tools that we talked about earlier in the slides previously. So we'll get to the remaining questions in the Q&A in just a moment, but these are specific resources and opportunities to learn more about this topic. So a lot of the resources on the left are places within Minnesota, but if you need referrals outside of Minnesota or in different locations, you can reach out to either of us and we can help you find someone who can support you in your work. These are even more resources too if you want to check them out. There are youth-specific resources as well. And then we do have another webinar. The last webinar of August is on navigating when a survivor is in crisis. So you can register for that. I'll send the link in the chat, as well as the September webinar series is up too, so you can check that out. And then this is our contact information. So if you want to reach out to Mary or myself, and I'll send instructions for requesting a certificate of attendance as well. But there were a few questions. Mary, if you have time, we have about 8 minutes. So we'll see if we can get through some of these questions. So one of them is, how do you approach a child to gain information from them that could be important for them to share, but they've been threatened not to tell by their own parent?
That's a really good question. So I am going to be honest here and say that that's a question that might be a little bit too big for this chat, because I think, so again, I think that's something that would need to be kind of very individualized. And I would also be very conscious if there's other dynamics present there, like if there's, is there CPS involvement? Is there court involvement? Is there police involvement? Are there other systems there where gathering information might be made more difficult? And that might be part of, your own involvement too. If, for folks who are asking that question, maybe you are involved in a specific system. I think, I know this seems a little paradoxical, but my own advice would be to really just give them time and space to talk about it, and to keep affirming, like, you can talk about whatever you want to talk about with me. You can talk about tricky things, you can talk about silly things, because oftentimes kids really need to trust someone. They need to know that a space is safe. And they're going to test that by talking about like the most inane things. You might talk for like 20 minutes about chocolate, because they're going to need to know that they can trust you and that they can trust what you'll do with that information.
Absolutely. Thank you. There's another question on how do children often respond to highly mobile lifestyles, couch hopping, or having experienced long-term homelessness? What are ways I can encourage parents who are experiencing homelessness to build secure connections with their kiddos to minimize the trauma or responses to a lack of secure shelter?
Yeah. So that's a great question, because it brings me back to something that I wanted to say a few minutes ago, but kind of lost my train of thought, which is that kids are so innately resilient. Like, it's just something about being a kid. They are so amazingly, like, they bounce back. We're starting to know more about, like, kids' brains are just amazing. They're so plastic. They're making all sorts of new connections. They can kind of rewire. Kids are cool, right? Kids are like way more adaptive than we think they ever can be, and they're constantly surprising us. So definitely there can be challenges present for kids in highly immobile situations. At the same time, there are challenges present for kids, in situations with secure housing. What I would recommend for parents in that situation and in any other situation is continue to communicate love and caring. Continue to communicate the things that'll stay the same. Like, we might be moving to a new place to stay, but I'm still going to be here. We'll still have our traditions. Make little routines. Maybe you make the same breakfast every morning, and maybe kiddo gets out the Pop-Tarts and mom puts them in the toaster. Little things like that can really provide consistency and stability. But just, and then providing opportunities to talk about it too, for maybe mom to say like, hey kiddo, how are you feeling about, about the move, or about the fact that, we're staying in a shelter right now. I'm giving them space to talk about it and letting them know it's okay to talk about it. That really starts to set them up with skills that will last and will adapt over time, because being able to talk about those things and talk about when it doesn't maybe feel good, that's going to be a huge advantage for them. So I hope that answers the question.
And then one last question in the Q&A. Teens who have been exposed have become disrespectful to their mom, who may have been the one experiencing domestic violence, blaming her for why they had to stay in a shelter. All of them are seeing a therapist, but it is a long way. Mom is really overwhelmed. Is there any way to mend the relationship?
That's a hard one, and that's one that will likely take time. I think providing a lot of support for mom, and giving her a lot of validation around the fact that she isn't alone in this. That unfortunately, especially for teens, that can be pretty common for them to identify more with the person who is being abusive, or just, in those situations when they're living with maybe mom and dad was being abusive towards mom, and dad is constantly giving these messages, like, this is mom's fault, then unfortunately they do incorporate that into their worldview. So I'm giving them time, giving them space, but at the same time setting those boundaries, having consequences, having rules, and following through on that. So that'll provide a sense of containment for those kids, because even as teens, when you're pushing back against anything and everything and every form of control, it is still comforting somewhere deep down within your soul to know that you have a caregiver who's there for you and who's going to keep you safe and follow through. And that's a situation where it is really, really, really important for mom to be getting support, or just to have someone to talk to work through those fears, and to have a space, especially for mom to be able to be vulnerable and be like, I wasn't a good parent. I yelled at the kids, or like, I didn't really like my kids today. To have a space to say those things and to not feel judged, but to feel seen and to feel kind of embraced as a whole being. Yeah, and again, really encourage you guys to reach out, whether to me, to Brennison, to both of us, if you have further questions or concerns. You've had such great questions. It's been a blast to answer them.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for joining us, Mary. And I know many of you also added more questions to the Q&A that Mary Beth was able to type out responses to. And so I'll try to include an attachment in the follow-up email that encompasses some of those responses and some things in the chat too, because those are really valuable things to take away from this as well. And as a reminder, this webinar is recorded, so it will be on our webpage that we'll include in the follow-up email. And then you can also email me to receive a certificate of attendance if that is something that you are interested in. But yeah, our contact information is on the screen, and it will be in the follow-up email as well. So feel free to reach out if you have any additional questions, and we hope to see you at future webinars. Thank you so much.
Thank you all.
Have a great rest of your day. I see people saying thank you in the chat. Have a wonderful rest of your Wednesday. Today is Wednesday. For some of us, maybe, depending where you are in the world. I'm going to go ahead and